Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today we are here with the newspaper of 1st of April 2024. So let's begin with the articles. So first, for detailed analysis, we have only one article today, and this is the art of India's HIV/AIDS response. This is on the editorial page, that is page number 6. And then after that, for prelims based analysis, we have two articles here. One, a record 60 traditional products from across India granted GI tag. So this is on page number 12. So about GI tags, and we'll discuss about what GI tags are. How neuroscience reshapes marketing strategies in India. This is on page number 9. A good explanation of how the things are changing with neuroscience taking the center stage. And then there are two articles which are from what we already have discussed. One, Philippines boosts maritime security as China tension rises. So something that we have been discussing the past few days. And compounding crisis, which is about water crisis that India is facing. So these are the headlines that we are going to discuss in today's news analysis. So let's begin with the first article, and this is the article on your editorial page, The Art of India's HIV/AIDS Response. Now, this art that they are talking about is ART, that is antiretroviral therapy. Now, there are certain things before we go on to understand what the article says and the various aspects of what has been discussed in the article. There are other things that we need to discuss first and then come back to the article. That will be wiser for us. So first, to also understand the various aspects of what the article discusses. So there are all these words that you will find in this article. So you should know what these words mean. What is a retrovirus, what is ART, what is HEART, and what is AZT. So these are some of the things which are often related to the treatment of HIV/AIDS. So we'll try to understand that. Now, first and foremost, when it comes to HIV/AIDS, HIV, when we say HIV is the name of the virus. Alright, HIV is the name of the virus, that is human immunodeficiency virus. Alright, human immunodeficiency virus, that is HIV. And this HIV virus leads to a very difficult disease to counter, and this is AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now we'll understand what exactly are the various aspects of HIV/AIDS and how do we look at the treatments. Now, treatment wise, of course, it is not something which is curable. HIV/AIDS is one of the biggest challenges that has been frightening the world for the past 30-40 years easily. Now, when it comes to the understanding of HIV/AIDS, we understand that it is not curable, but there are certain treatment options that will help in ensuring that people who are suffering with AIDS will be able to live with AIDS, that they can prolong their life and they can lead a longer life without facing a lot of complications. So that is where we see that there are certain treatments or options which are available. Now, in this regard, the very first thing that we need to know about is the ART, that is antiretroviral treatment or antiretroviral therapy. Now, this antiretroviral therapy basically is a kind of medical treatment that is used to manage and control the HIV virus. And that's why when it comes to this HIV virus, we know that this is something that causes acquired immunodeficiency syndrome or AIDS. Now, this ART, that is ART, it does not cure HIV, as I told you, but it is something that can significantly prolong the lives of many people who are infected with this virus, and that's why it can improve their quality of life. It can reduce the risk of HIV transmissions as well. So that's why this ART treatment becomes very crucial to understand that it is something that will help in to prolong life for the people who are living with AIDS. So that's why this becomes very, very crucial for us to understand that people who are infected, it prolongs their life, it improves their quality of life, and it prolongs life, improves, and it reduces chances of transmission. So this is the importance of this particular treatment, that is called as ART. Now, there is another form of ART which is called as highly active antiretroviral therapy. Alright, that is called as HART. Highly active. HA stands for highly active antiretroviral treatment. Now, this basically is a treatment regimen which is required for HIV/AIDS that involves a combination of 3 or more different types of antiretroviral drugs. And this is something that aims to reduce the amount of HIV in the blood to go to almost undetectable levels, and that is something that improves the immune system's function and slows the progress of HIV to causing AIDS. So that's why we see that in this particular scenario, when it comes to heart, this is a combination. This is a combination of antiretroviral drugs. Alright, and this is something that will ensure that the HIV levels in blood is suppressed. Alright, so what we see is that in this particular scenario, heart becomes a very, very important technique in ensuring that people will be able to live longer, and it also improves their quality of life, and it's a much better way in which the ART or ART works. Now, when it comes to these combinations of antiretroviral drugs that we are speaking of, this is where we antiretroviral drugs that we are looking for, this is where we come to the treatment, and the treatment is one of the drugs which is called as AZT. Now, this AZT basically stands for azithromycin. So this stands for, this, just remember that this stands for azithromycin or thymidine, whatever you want to call it. So this is AZT. Now, this AZT is basically the drug. This was the first antiretroviral drug that was approved for the treatment of HIV/AIDS. Now, the discovery and subsequently what we saw was that in 1987, this is where it was approved for treatment or to be used against HIV epidemic. Now, this is something that works by inhibiting the activity of the reverse transcriptase. This is an enzyme that HIV uses to replicate its genetic material. So just understand this, that how does it work? How does this AZT work? So in case of AZT, what we understand is that this AZT, how does it work? First and foremost, it will try to inhibit the activity of the reverse transcriptase. It will inhibit the activity of reverse transcriptase. Alright, it will reverse the activities of reverse transcriptase, and this basically is an enzyme. Just remember this, that this is an enzyme that HIV actually uses to replicate all its genetic material into the DNA that is there within the host cell. Alright, so this is basically what will be done. So this reverse transcriptase, just remember that this reverse transcriptase, this is an enzyme used by HIV to replicate its RNA into the host DNA, right? Into the host DNA. So what happens is that once the RNA is entering the host DNA, this is where RNA will start giving instructions to the DNA to replicate this HIV. So what happens is that this genetic material enters the body, and once it enters the body, it starts giving instructions. It starts giving instructions to the body, the host, let's say in this case the humans, and then what happens is that the human genes will start to replicate this virus, because now they are getting this instruction from this genetic material, that is RNA, that was sent by the HIV. So now HIV starts to take over and starts replicating itself a lot. Now when it comes to AZT, AZT basically tries to block this process. All right, AZT will try to block this process. Alright, it will try to block this process, and this is by blocking this process, AZT helps to prevent the virus from multiplying, and that's why it can reduce the amount of HIV in the body. So that's why we understand that this is basically what happens. Now coming to retrovirus. Now what we are saying is that these are antiretroviral drugs. So when it comes to antiretroviral drugs, just understand what do we mean by retrovirus. So retroviral basically refers to anything that is related to or caused by a retrovirus. Now when it comes to retrovirus, this is a kind of virus that replicates in a host cell through the process of reverse transcription. Alright, so that's why this enzyme that we are talking about, that they use this enzyme called as called as reverse transcriptase. So with the help of this, what they do is that they replicate in the host cell with the process of reverse transcription. All right, they basically, the retrovirus would replicate, they replicate in the host cell, with reverse transcription process. Okay, so this is basically what they'll do. Now what happens is that unlike most of the other viruses, the retroviruses, they carry their genetic material in the form of RNA rather than DNA, and that's why when they when they infect the cell, they would use an enzyme which is called as this reverse transcriptase to convert their RNA into the DNA material inside the body, and this is something which is then integrated with the host cell's genome, and that's why this allows the virus to start replicating as the host cell starts to replicate. So that's why what happens is that the number of these will start to increase, the retrovirus numbers will start to increase. And the most well-known example of a retrovirus is this HIV. And that's why we understand that retroviral in this context is basically about the retrovirus. So understand these terms, because very often in the case of HIV, we talk about all these terms, and these terms will be often mentioned. Even in this article, you'll see that there is a lot of use of all these terms. So for you to understand that article, this is something that you need to understand. Now, even before, again, one more thing before we move on to what the article says, and that's not really as important as everything else that we are discussing around it. Now this is where our understanding of this entire battle against AIDS that India has led is also very, very important. Now in this regard, there is an entire case study, you can say, of how India has been able to avert a pandemic. That the steps that were taken by India and Indian companies back in 1990s and the early 2000s have ensured that this epidemic did not become a pandemic, and we could restrain it. We could reduce the total numbers, as the article also has mentioned. Now in this regard, one very, very important mention is for Dr. Yusuf Hamid of the company Cipla. You might have heard of Cipla, the medicine company. Now this Cipla, led by Yusuf Hamid, Dr. Yusuf Hamid, has played a very, very important role in ensuring that we could ensure that the number of cases of AIDS could be brought down. Now understand what happened here. if you look at and go into the history of our understanding of AIDS, you'll find that in the early days, in the 1970s and 80s, our understanding of AIDS was not that great. And initially, because the main problem is that when it comes to this HIV, the HIV is infecting the cell, it is starting to replicate itself, and it starts to weaken the immune system of the body. Now, what is the role of immune system in the body? The immune system will fight all the diseases in our body, correct? So now what happens is that this HIV, it will infect the human immune system, and it will weaken the immune system. Now, as the immune system becomes weak, all the other diseases can infect the person very easily. So that's why the same person can very easily get infected, for example, with tuberculosis or any other disease as such. So then what happens is, because our body is not able to fight, because immune system has become weak. So now what was happening is that initially we could not understand that this was because of HIV, because we saw all these diseases in the person who was infected with HIV virus. Later it was found that it was HIV virus, and then the name AIDS was given to this particular problem. Now, although we understood that this was HIV virus causing AIDS, but still we did not have any treatment against it. No treatment existed against it. And till date there is no cure for AIDS. There are only some invasive techniques that we have been trying, and doctors across the globe have been trying. But unfortunately there is no cure yet. But there are drugs which are available, and where we talk about the drugs like AZT, etc. Now, when this AZT became available, the price of AZT was very, very high. The price of AZT was $8,000 per annum. $8,000 per annum. Now you just do the calculation in terms of Indian rupees, and we are talking about 1990s. So although this AZT was available now, but when it comes to this patent of AZT, it belonged to a US based company. So the US based company had the patent to AZT, and that's why it was the only company that had this AZT, and they patented it and they started selling it at a very high cost. But where is the problem? The problem is that most of the people who were infected with AIDS by the 90s were people who were very, very poor. In India, in other parts of Asia, especially South Asia, plus in many of the countries in Africa, we saw that these were the areas which were largely having the impact of AIDS. And for people living in these areas, it was impossible for them to shell out $8,000 per annum. Correct? It was almost impossible for them. We are talking about almost 7 lakh rupees per annum, which was impossible for people who were poor. Now, that's why this was, you can say that this was a scenario where it was impossible for India, or let's say any person individually, to afford these drugs. Now, this is where the role of Dr. Yusuf Hamid becomes crucial, because he was intrigued by the potential of the AIDS treatment drugs, and that is why he started a journey to make them affordable. And in 1986, where we had very little knowledge about AIDS, he started showing interest upon learning about AZT, because AZT back then was the only known AIDS treatment drug at the time. And this, as I told you, it was priced at $8,000 per annum. Now, overall, when it comes to this, we see that by 1993, Cipla started manufacturing AZT at almost, you can say, 1/10 the price of the international price, but still remain very unaffordable for most of the people, right? So even if it was brought down to almost $800 per annum, yet it was unaffordable. It was still not easy for people to afford this. And still we saw that the sales of these kind of drugs were still very low, because it was difficult for people to even think of it. Now, this was AZT. This was AZT, all right, which was used in the art treatment therapy. Now comes the heart therapy, where we see that a cocktail of drugs is being used in which has been seen to be effective in controlling the cases of AIDS. But then the price here was even more than this. It was $12,000 $12,000 per annum. Now this is where you can say in a manner Dr. Hamid, he had a resolve to make these drugs affordable, and this is where he started offering a price which was pretty low. And this is when now we see that he also started alliances with international activists as well, and we see that a lot of activists are also involved. And then he also goes to Doctors Without Borders, and this is where with all that he also goes to Government of India, and he says that if we are allowed to mass produce this, right now we are not mass producing and we are charging almost $800 per annum, but if we are allowed to mass produce this, I can, or we can, bring down the price to $350 per annum. Now this is where a huge outroar also happened internationally, because many of these big pharmaceutical companies, they didn't like it, because on one hand they could have sold the same drugs for $8,000 to $12,000, and on the other hand you have this company who's saying that okay, we are going to make it for $350 per annum if we are allowed to mass produce. Now this is where the Government of India also comes into the picture, and the Government of India says that okay, fine, you can do it. You are allowed from our end, you start go ahead with making this drug at a very large scale. Now this is something that was not liked by a lot of companies in the West, because this is where we see that they also start coming forward and say that we are going to boycott India, and all these kind of things are being threatened by them. And forget about these companies, because pharmaceutical companies are known to be like this. They always have been a cartel, to say the least. Now in this regard, what we see is that not only these companies, the private companies, the big pharma companies, even the US President George W. Bush, he even came in the support of these companies against CIPLA. Now even he said that maybe we should put sanctions on India, and these kind of things were being said. Now India said that okay, the second stance that we see from the Indian side is that India says that we are going to provide it for free. We'll distribute it to the other South Asian countries, and we'll distribute it to African countries, and we'll ensure that they all get the access to these drugs. So on one hand, there is this side of the world which is trying to save lives, and then there is the other side of the world, the Western side of the world, which is trying to earn as much profits as they can from these life-saving, so-called life-saving drugs. So, and even if they are not affordable, so what? For the people for whom it is affordable, they are selling it there, and they are the ones who are giving them all the money that they could, all the profits that they could. So who cares about the people who are poor? Who cares about the people who are dying? As it is said that when one person dies, it's a news. When a million people die, it's a statistics. So this is what was happening here, that it was just a statistics. The statistics were saying that there are 1,500 people per day who are getting infected with HIV/AIDS. Yet nobody cared. Yet the bigger companies did not care, because they were getting the kind of profits that they wanted. So unfortunately this all happened, and that's why his role becomes very, very crucial, that how he contributed to all of these, the role of all the agencies like Doctors Without Borders, or all the activists, even US based activists, who also started supporting this cause. Because before this we saw that there was a lawsuit in South Africa when they started making a cocktail drugs in Africa. So that's why we see that this is something that is not only something that challenged the multinational drug companies, the stronghold that they have in the patent protected drugs in the market, and at the same time how it has been able to, as we say, that it ensured that India could lead the way to avert this pandemic altogether. So that's why all this becomes very, very crucial in the context of this article, where it talks about what all has been done. That on April 1st, 2004, India launched the ART for people living with HIV/AIDS. And this is where we saw that a lot of effort has been made, a lot of effort from the different initiatives, and how even educational programs and awareness campaigns have been run by the country. All that becomes very, very crucial in this context of how we look at the number of cases dropping now, which is very, very crucial to understand that now we see that the number of cases in India, it has come down, and the prevalence rate, etc., also have come down, which is wonderful success in this particular aspect. Now coming to the articles for prelims examination. First article is on GI tag, that a record 60 traditional products from across India have been granted GI tag. Now when it comes to GI tag, first and foremost, what do we mean by GI tag? GI here stands for geographical indication. Geographical indication. Now geographical indication, when it comes to it, basically this is given to anything which belongs to, which has its properties because of the origin. So any product, it could be a natural product, an agricultural based product, a handicraft, an artwork, a painting, anything that has its regional significance, and it has its market value because of where it comes from. So for example, when we talk about Nagpuri oranges, or when we talk about basmati rice, so all these are examples of you can say geographical indication in various different parts of the country. Rasgulla is also an example. Rasgola is another example, that where we see that Odisha has a GI tag and West Bengal has a GI tag. So there are all these things which have been given GI tag. A lot of agricultural products, a lot of natural products, but a lot of handloom also, handicraft also, all these are also given GI tags. Now when it comes to the GI tags, what we see is that a record number of new GI tags have been given, and now the number of GI tags in India has gone beyond 600. So there are more than 600 GI tags as of today. So that's why this is something that will also help in conservation of the tradition, in conservation of the things that belong to that region, and also creating a market for the people who are involved with this. So it also helps a lot of farmers, it also helps a lot of artisans, a lot of people who are involved with the handloom and the handicrafts. So it all helps them all. So that's why this GI tag, getting that GI tag becomes very, very crucial, and many a times it also has a lot of significant, you can say, market value that it promotes for a lot of people. So recently what we have seen is that India has been able to give almost more than 60 GI tags across the country, and this is where we see that even Banaras Thandai has been given a GI tag now. So this is something where you can say that this is unprecedented in the terms of the number of products which have simultaneously received the GI tag. The initiative basically is, so that's why it is the largest single issuance of GI tags in India, that shows the diverse cultural heritage of India. Now in this particular scenario, there are a lot of things that have been given the GI tags. A lot of them have been given from Assam, and then apart from that from other northeastern states like in Tripura and also in Meghalaya, and at the same time there are some from other parts of India as well. Now this is something which is very, very crucial, because this initiative also highlights the increasing efforts by the various states to safeguard and promote their traditional products on a national and also even at a global stage, at a global scale. So that's why among all the products that have been receiving the GI tags, we see that there were 6 traditional crafts from Assam that have been given the GI tag, and at the same time we see that there are others that have been given additionally. For example, there are 13 other Assamese products that have been given the GI tag. So that's why there are all these products that have been given the GI tag, and at the same time there are musical instruments also which have been recognized here, and they also have been given the GI tag. So that's why just remember that it's not only about, because many a times we only see the name of the natural and the agricultural product, but just remember that here we are seeing that even musical instruments have been given. Musical instruments have been given the GI tag. Then apart from that we see that there are a lot of different products, a lot of traditional instruments have been given the GI tag. Terracotta, a kind of terracotta has been given, a kind of silk has been given. So there are all these things that have been given the GI tag. And then apart from that we see that there are other products from other regions as well. So for example, the Banaras Tabla or the Banaras Thandai, they also have been, the Shehnai, they also have been given the GI tag. So that's why there are all these things that have been given the GI tag, and that's why this is one aspect where we see that we are creating a lot of value, because this was a traditional criticism for on India, that we do not safeguard our cultural heritage. But in the past couple of decades, you can say at least last 10-15 years, we have seen that there are a lot of improvements that we have seen in this regard, whether it is with regard to patents or even with regards to the geographical indication, that starts creating a value for people, especially for the people who did not really see the impact that it can have. Right? So the next article that we have is how neuroscience reshapes marketing strategies in India. Now overall, when it comes to this particular article, this article talks about how exactly do we see that today neuroscience is actually helping in a lot of marketing campaigns, a lot of advertisements. So there is something which is called as neuromarketing. Neuromarketing. So neuromarketing basically is the marketing which is based on neuroscience. Now what do we mean by neuroscience? Neuroscience is the science of the nervous system and the brain, which you can say is one of the most complex systems that our body has. So that's the complexity of the brain, the complexity of how it works as a machine, you can say a self-run machine, is something which is wonderful. And that's why we see that the insights into the neuroscience, insights into the understanding of the nervous system and the brain has led to us understanding a lot of new aspects. So for example, very recently we know that there was it was in the news where we talked about the implant that was introduced by Elon Musk, correct? The brain computer interface, as we call them. So for the first time it was introduced, where he showcased that how it is possible to control the brain activities with the help of these kind of chips. So now we see that there is a rise in neuromarketing as well. So when we say neuromarketing, the neuromarketing is something that provides insights into the subconscious aspects of decision making, whereas when it comes to traditional marketing, it largely relies on the self-reported data via the surveys or the focus groups, etc. So understand this, how the difference is. That in the traditional marketing, let's say somebody comes to you with a survey and they have given you a questionnaire, a set of 10 questions, and they've asked you, okay, mark the correct answers according to what you think. Now what you write there may not be always the correct thing that you're writing, correct? You may feel something, but you may feel that, okay, this is not the correct thing to write, so let me write this, or let me tick mark this option, correct? So that is one aspect. But in neuromarketing, the things are different, because they basically are going into the subconscious aspect of decision making, and they are not relying on what you have said, rather what your brain is thinking. They are relying on that. So that's why according to research, 85% of the consumer decisions are not made consciously. And that's why when it comes to neuromarketing, it assesses, it offers the access to all this particular territory for a deeper analysis of the consumer preferences and the behavior. Now overall what we see is that there are various different techniques, and all these techniques are what have been discussed in this article as well. That for example, you can use the EEG or electroencephalography, or you can use something called as the functional magnetic resonance imaging, the MRI, as you might know. So all these things can be used. So that's why implicit association test, EEGs, eye trackers, thermal imaging cameras, so all these kind of things can be used to get the direct insights into the brain impact and the emotional responses altogether. And even something like an MRI, as I told you, there is something called as functional MRI. So functional MRI can be used. So at the same time, we see that there are different physiological and neurological responses for the objective data about the consumer reactions that can be taken. And that's why when we look at the in-person focus group, they would be trying to focus upon all these different strategies to understand their consumer. And these techniques, that's why they are used primarily in the research or the clinical settings to understand and study the brain functions, and that's why they are not very common as compared to the traditional marketing research. Because many a times when it comes to, let's say, these kind of aspects of marketing, they can also be a little more expensive than the traditional ways, and that's why we see that there is some kind of resistance from the companies in ensuring that they can also use these techniques. Only the bigger companies for which these techniques are easily affordable, they are the ones to use them. So that's why the brands and the neuromarketing agencies, they very often are concentrating on the technologies that are accessible and suitable for their needs. So that's why all these things, even facial recognition, for example, that can also be counted as one of these techniques that they are using in a lot of ways. So that's why we see that there are all these tests, all these techniques that are being used, and these methods, they can provide insight into the emotional reaction of a consumer, and also the attention and the subconscious response to the marketing stimuli that are being created by this neuroscience. So that's why this brings in a new aspect of science into marketing and advertising that we right now do not see as being very common. Now let's look at the next article. This is, now here we are in the revisited headline section. Now just understand that when it comes to revisited headlines, our purpose here is that these are not new news. So they do not need new notes for you, but these are going to add on to the already existing notes. So that is what you should do, that you should not see it as a new news article every time. Add on to the already existing notes, compound to the already existing notes. So first is, Philippines boosts maritime security as China tension rises. Now again, something that we have been seeing for the past couple of weeks, where we see that this time the president of Philippines, he has directed the administration to enhance the maritime security collaboration to address all the various significant challenges that they are facing from China and what threatens the country's territorial integrity and the peace. And we know that this comes after the intensifying dispute that has happened with China. Although one thing to note here also is that they have not explicitly mentioned China. All right, they have not mentioned China. They have not mentioned that we are going to do all that, that we are enhancing the maritime security because we are facing a problem with China. So that's why just remember that China is not explicitly mentioned in this entire scenario, but we know that China is playing a big part in all that, because overall when it comes to the maritime route in the South China Sea, we know that the annual ship-based trade that happens through the South China Sea is worth over $3 trillion. All right, it's worth more than $3 trillion, which is huge. So that's why everybody understands the role South China Sea plays for their economy as well. And that's why when it comes to China's expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea, it creates a lot of clash with several other South Asian nations as well, whether it is Philippines or Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei. All these countries, they have been facing problems with China. So that's why we have to understand this, that even the Permanent Court of Arbitration, it had ruled that China does not have any legal basis back in 2016. Yet you know how much China cares about international rules, unfortunately. So that's why we see that there are escalations that keep on happening every now and then, and this is with regard to the recent escalation that happened over the last weekend. Now coming to the last article for the day, and this is about compounding crisis. Now this is where we are talking about water related deficit and problems that we have been facing, and specifically what we have mentioned in the context of Karnataka and other South Indian states as well. So that's why this article basically highlights the severe water scarcity that we have been facing in the southern part of the country, where the reservoirs are filled only up to 23% capacity, 9% below the decadal average that we have seen. Now significantly this is very, very low compared to the requirements, and at the same time what we see is that there are a lot of issues that they are facing. The first challenge is also a geographical challenge, where we see that El Nino plays a big role, because the present El Nino The current El Nino, that is one of the strongest that we have seen, it basically is something that makes monsoon more erratic, and that's why contributes to a lot of water shortage, and this is one of the major reasons this year as well that we are seeing this problem. Now at the same time, what we see is that following 2023, which was the hottest year on record, meteorologists have predicted that there will be even higher temperatures for 2024, and the likelihood of breaking all the records until even 2026. So that's why this heat is going to contribute to a lot of crisis, and maybe we are just looking at the beginning of the crisis to come. And at the same time, it also mentions about the election season, that because we have the general election this year, there will be millions of people who will be spending more time outside this year, and that's a potentially it will increase the demand for water during the summer time. So although this will be not a very big part of the entire crisis that we are facing, because the problem lies with the day-to-day activities itself. So these events, they will be a month-long event and will not create a lot of crisis as such, but yes, it will be a contributing factor. Then apart from that, there have been previous aspects of the crisis as well. We know that even before this, during the last time we had the El Nino problem, and this was during 2014 to 16. We saw that 2017 also there was insufficient progress in having water, and overall what we see is that although we see that there are all these issues, we have also seen problems with the preparedness and the policy implementation by the government as well. That whether it comes to unplanned urban growth, or over extraction of the groundwater, or low water reuse levels that we see in India, insufficient involvement of the communities, and degradation of the catchment areas, they all have been there, and we know that these are issues which are very, very strong issues. So that's why whether it comes to urban growth, or over extraction of groundwater, insufficient community involvement, or even as I just mentioned, that even the degradation of the catchment areas, they also, you can mention degradation of catchment areas, and also insufficient water reuse. So there are all these issues that we are facing, and that's why, and the governments at the center and the state levels, they have to take care of all these. The broader context of climate change also is something that adds another layer of complexity. Even when it comes to El Nino, we do say, and there are research that claims that El Nino years have been prolonged now compared to what we have seen in the past, and that also is because of climate change. So that's why we understand that climate change is something that increases the crisis and makes the crisis more frequent, and at the same time it also compounds the socio-economic disparities as well, especially for the low and middle income countries like India. So that's why there are all these aspects that we need to understand, that how climate change also plays a big factor in all this, and it adds to all the other problems that are causing the issue. So that's why we need to understand all the issues where exactly the policy and action is required from the side of the government as well. Now let's look at the mains questions for today. First question: discuss the role of public health policy and international collaboration in addressing the HIV/AIDS epidemic in India. Evaluate the impact of reducing free antiretroviral treatment or therapy on the socio-economic aspects of affected communities. So here we are talking about the ART and the different areas of contribution that we need from national and international perspectives, that how some of the international organizations can play a role, where for example Doctors Without Borders in the initial days played a very, very significant role in India. So all these things from the policy perspective, what are the things being done and what can be done further. And then examine the factors contributing to the acute water crisis in India. Suggest comprehensive strategies for sustainable water management to mitigate for future crisis. Now this is again something I'm very sure that we have discussed this n number of times, and there are a lot of things that you also know, but the thing here is that you have to collate all the information into one single piece that is your answer and write all that. You know a lot of points. How you implement all those points in writing an answer is what is important here. Otherwise, it's not a difficult question to answer. So this is it for today's session. I hope this session has been helpful for you. Thank you very much for being here.